Okay, we're here to talk about Act of Union. I'm going to go through the two sonnets. I'm going to link to other poems, and I'm going to focus as ever a lot on AO2 language form and structure. Okay, so beginning, first of all, the title itself, Act of Union, is incredibly important. As you all know, it's a play on words. Act of Union refers to the political union of 1801 that was forced on Ireland. Now, one of the things that Irish people like to point to, and it's a very good point, is if you look at the Union flag, the British flag, there is no Irish part to it, yeah? It's been taken out, hasn't it? Yeah. So it's more of an imposition of a union. Think about, we study Macbeth, think about, you've got the English-Scottish Union, which, was far more, I hesitate to use the word necessarily equal, but much more agreed than this, which is much more of an act of colonialism. We also know that the term union can refer to marriage, to sexuality, and to marriage, okay? And you can actually refer to marriage as an act of union. So there's this play on words, and this is the sort of central conceit of the poem. In many ways, we could see this poem as linking to metaphysical poetry that uses conceits. That's surprising comparisons. And here the landscape of Ireland is gendered female. We know that there's a long tradition of this, which we call the Ashling tradition of Irish poetry. And we know that using the metaphor of rape for colonialism is a very powerful one. But it's an interesting one, obviously, because then it makes you a little bit more of a female victim. And this is something that we see throughout Heaney's work. When we looked at the Tomb Road, for instance, it was Heaney actually criticizing the Irish for being a little bit passive. That is certainly one very legitimate reading. Now, we know that it comes from the collection North, which is 1975, and this is post-Bloody Sunday. We know that North is his darkest collections of poetry. It also contains the titular poem North itself, which I'm going to talk about as I go through today. And this is a really dark period in Heaney's work where the violence and the Viking ancestry and the cycle of violence is the dominating theme through many of the poems. Notice the way he begins. Tonight. Breaking the word tonight, lengthening it, splitting it. I'm going to say that that's very important in a moment and go into that more. Susurras, tonight, a first movement. Susurras, a pulse, susurras. It's like a slow beating. It reminds me very much of North with the drum beat and the idea of, a slow rhythm at first. Also, what's very apparent is it's meant to be a slow sexual act at first, tentative, etc. Now, I make no apologies for the fact that I'm going to be using a lot of sexual imagery in this poem because I think it's absolutely impossible to talk about it in any other way. As if the rain in the bogland gathered in the head to slip and flood. So we have all of this kind of fluid imagery, which is sexual imagery, but also amniotic fluid imagery. So immediately you might be thinking about the bog poems. You might be thinking about punishment. I think that that's a very good link. Where the little adulteress is punished for her sexuality and violence is visited upon her. So I see a big link there. But in punishment, the contrast is, the implication is that the woman had sexual agency, that she chose to be an adulteress. And because of that, she was ritualistically punished and used as this kind of human sacrifice. If we think about the Tolan man, which is another link, it's very different there. Because in the Tolan man, the dark juices of the female earth are very predatory. And female sexuality there is seen as aggressive. Here, female sexuality is seen as more passive. We see the land as a female victim. And so the brilliance of the poem is the way that he maps the geography of Ireland onto the female body. And he does this very beautifully. But before I go into that, I just want to point out as well the sonic patterning. This is a beautifully patterned poem. So I'm going to illustrate this with this line. A bog burst. So we have these plosive Bs. Notice another hyphenated word suggesting a kind of build-up of pressure. Again, I don't need to go into the sexual imagery too much for you to understand. A gash breaking open the ferny bed. Well, look at the plosives, the Gs against the soft F. So we have this beautiful patterning between violent consonants and softer consonants that seems to be a patterning throughout the whole poem between the male and the female, between the aggressor and the victim. And this, I think, is another beautiful and amazing bit. He says, your back is a firm line of the eastern coast. Now, Heaney uses this idea and this imagery a number of times, that if we look at Ireland, it looks as though you have your back. It looks like Ireland has its back to England, doesn't it? Geographically. And I think that this is another brilliant moment, and I remember in the exam to evaluate poetry and to say what's good, because it's almost like a sort of unhappy marriage or an unhappy relationship in which the female is turning away from the man, almost like a kind of marital bed imagery where we see the estrangement between them. Now, the key thing to understand this poem, and I've seen it done wrongly by a lot of critics, is, and I may be wrong, but my reading of it, this is a first-person poem from a male perspective, but within the psychology of a rapist. That's the important thing, because there's a lot of denial of the rape act itself. Now, if we think about the act of union means to unity, bringing things together, really that in itself could be questioned. Isn't it an act of imposition instead? So think about the lens and the form and the psychology and whose eyes we're looking for. And he says, a firm line of the East Coast, and arms and legs are thrown beyond your gradual hills. Well, this is seen as kind of disturbingly sexually inviting, isn't it? As vulnerability. And do you see why I say that we're looking and we're working within the psychology of rape? Beyond your gradual hills. And here again, the psychology of the rapist, I caress. So isn't it the case that an act of rape is being reframed as an act of kind of flirtation, of foreplay? When in actual fact, we know with the back turned that the woman doesn't want it. So do you see why I see it within the psychology of rape? Beyond your gradual hills. Now, once again, this is a conceit that was used by many metaphysical poets, most famously by John Donne, when he compares, he says, "Oh, my America, my newfound land." And what he does is he runs his hands over America. He undresses and makes love to it. And he sees the land as something inviting, as something sexy. And this kind of conceit of seeing new land as something sexual is really interesting. From a kind of Freudian perspective, I think we would see the act of conquest and colonialism as a highly sexual act then, as a libidimal act. And that's really interesting because notice how he sexualizes the land. The heaving province where our past has grown. And here it's interesting, the self-perception. I am the tall kingdom over your shoulder. There's a real assertion here of authority, masculinity, strength and power, and the T's and the K's, giving this sense of power that you would neither cajole nor ignore. Now, what does that mean? So it means that it seems to me that you won't cooperate with me, but you're not ignoring me. Now, I would question that and say that I think most Irish people would say they did ignore. But again, if we think about this as being within the psychology of rape, then it's kind of you're asking for it psychology. Do you see? Conquest is a lie. Very short sentence there. Notice the Caesura closes it off. It's an insertion of an idea. It doesn't belong. It's a non sequitur. It doesn't belong within the line of thought, actually. What does it actually mean? Is he saying that I didn't conquer you? Or is he saying that the act of conquest is a lie? I favor the sort of former. I think he's saying, you're lying when you said it's a conquest. And I think that what Heaney is saying is this is the bad faith of the British mind. I'm not going to say English, because let's not forget that many of the invaders were Scottish. It is the bad faith of the colonial mind that says it wasn't an act of violence and force. Let's not forget the title, Act of Union. Act of Union suggests some kind of consensual thing. Now, why have I used this idea of the psychology of rape so much? Well, when you read accounts by rapists, so often they say it was an act of love, she asked for it, or it was consensual, etc. So my reading of it is that Heaney is very much using that idea. But what's weird is the Volta, this is, a lot of people call it a Shakespearean sonnet. Shakespearean sonnets usually have a strong rhyming couplet, and that's where the Volta is delivered, and the power of the message comes in the final rhyming couplet. But check this out. In the middle of this line, I grow older. It's almost like this desire for conquest and the sexual desire and everything starts to fade, isn't it? I grow older, like you're getting weaker. Now, it may be fanciful of me, but I would like to link this to the actual kind of historical conquest. And if we think about the arc of British imperialism, what happens after the war? India gets independence, doesn't it? And then Africa starts to follow, etc. And the colonial possessions begin to be given up, don't they? It's almost like there's a kind of resignation that that era has gone. But Ireland is a curious one, isn't it? Because it's part of the imperial legacy, and you can't get rid of it. And that's why the rape and the unwanted pregnancy is such a powerful metaphor to use. And he says here, conceding, that's a soft word, isn't it? With sibilant C's. You're half independent. Look at that again. See the split, like tonight? And we come back and we've got half independent, brilliantly hyphenated, isn't it? To show the curious status of Ireland, within whose borders now my legacy culminates inexorably. Inexorably being a beautiful word, isn't it? It's not going to go away, is it? So here we've got the dismantling of binaries, haven't we? Are you an outside power, or are you an inside power? Or is there some kind of hybridity going on here? So you can't draw firm lines and borders. And as I record this particular screencast, I'm thinking about Brexit and about how Northern Ireland is going to sink Brexit more than anything, because where does it belong? Is it in Britain? Is it in Ireland? Is it in the EU? It becomes this kind of liminal space, doesn't it? That's really hard to define. And that's why I think the metaphor is absolutely brilliant. Just earlier, I also wanted to talk about this idea of the drumbeat and to link it very much to the idea of North. Okay, I think North is a brilliant poem to link to. But of course, I think as well, as I said earlier, you have the link to the poem Punishment as well, to the adulteress. I think there are lots of different links there, both thematically and in terms of some of the imagery. Now, the second stanza, it's interesting that he chooses to have two different stanzas. I think the Volta is more in this line here, I grow older, where there's a real change in tone, rather than between these two. I notice that other screencasts on this often say, look, they're completely separate. I don't think they are. I think they're quite continuous, don't you? The fact that the second sonnet begins with an and, with an additive connective, is really interesting because it suggests a degree of continuity. If we are looking for a split, I think sonnet 1 concerns rape and sonnet 2 concerns more kind of gestation and birth, doesn't it? Yeah. So we have a continuation of the controlling conceit of the poem. And he says, I am still imperially male. Well, isn't that interesting? Because it's almost like there's a sense of exhaustion here and resignation. But here, it's almost like he's trying to reassure himself that he's still a macho man. He's still masculine. He's still in control. Leaving you in pain. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? It's a kind of concession of the damage that's done. And there's going to be a lot more concessions of the damage. So there is some change in tone in the second part. And then we have these horrible R's and plosives, the rending process in the colony, the battering ram, these kind of phallic imagery of rape, the boom burst within, kind of orgasmic images here, the act sprouted. Don't need to go too much into this. I think we can all see how the extended metaphor works. What does it produce? What is the fruits of this act of rape? It is a fifth column. So here, of course, he's referring to the Unionists. Okay. Now, he uses the term fifth column because the fifth column is like an enemy within, isn't it? And what's interesting now is, whereas they were opponents before sort of rapist and victim, now they share a common enemy. And these are the Ulster Unionists, aren't they? Apologies to Ulster Unionists listening to this screencast. This is through the eyes of Heaney, of course, yeah? So the fifth column is not wanted by anyone. They're enemies to both countries, aren't they? And this is where, again, the poem becomes incredibly powerful, because this idea of being unwanted offspring, the British don't want them. The father doesn't acknowledge really his offspring either. The mother seems to have a baby that hates her and is like a parasitic enemy within her, like the film Alien, or as I've written here, Rosemary's Baby, where a woman realizes that she's going to give birth to Satan or some kind of demonic thing. Now that is actually used as a trope in horror quite often, isn't it? The film Alien, where men are impregnated by this hideous alien-like creature, it's a really powerful and terrifying image, particularly for male readers, where things like pregnancy, etc., might be associated with the other. Here we have the war drum again, which is really important, and it seems to be a reference to the present, to the Northern Irish fife and drums, to the different marches across Northern Ireland that commemorate the massacre of Catholics and celebrate acts of victory over Ireland. And it's beautifully written here where he says, his heart beneath your heart is a war drum. Now, if you think about how beautiful and how clever this is, one day when you have children, you'll realize that the magical moment when you have a fetus is the heartbeat, isn't it? And people even buy devices so they can listen to their baby's heartbeat or watch them on scanners. It's the magical moment, isn't it, where we associate heartbeats with life. Now, generally speaking, it's a moment of joy. But here, it's a threatening moment. The heartbeat becomes a war drum. So I'm thinking, linking to north, isn't it? Linking to the idea that there's a looming danger of violence, etc. So it's brilliantly incongruent with how we would normally associate a heartbeat. Mustering force. So we've got this horrible M sound here, the fricative force, as we realize that this heartbeat is a prelude to violence, not to familial joy. And then we have another nasty metaphor, his parasitical and ignorant little fists already beat at your borders. Brilliant line again, I think, where we imagine this nasty, demonic little fetus beating it in the mother's womb. It's though he's born to hate. And I guess, what is the fruit of hate? What is the fruit of rape? It is this, isn't it? Now, if you are a Protestant in Northern Ireland, you're going to feel very offended by this, aren't you? It is actually sort of likening you to an unwanted spawn of rape, demonic, angry, vicious, mindless, nihilistic, angry with both your parents, which is really interesting. So Heaney seems to be writing this to the British as much as he is to Catholic Irish people, pointing out that acts of colonialism often produce unwanted offspring that do not go away. They beat at your borders, okay? So he's saying, he's talking to the Irish woman, isn't he? But notice this, and I know they're cocked at me. So it's not just her that's the victim. He recognizes that his offspring is going to come for him too. Let's not forget the conservative and unionist government of the 1970s. Very often the unionists have held the conservatives over a barrel. We saw that recently with Boris Johnson. When the unionists get power over the English, they will use it and they will force issues. And I think Heaney is kind of alluding to this to his English readers. No treaty, and because at the time they were discussing treaties, I foresee will solve completely your tracked and stretch marked body. Lovely sibilant sound there, isn't it? Salve. As heal, thinking about images of balm and healing. Now, why is this so powerful? Why is it so evocative? Well, I don't want to go too much into this in a class mainly of girls, but obviously birth often is a very powerful rending process that will leave behind wounds and needs for stitches, and things are done to the female body like stretch marks very often that show the difficulty of the body to cope with this fetus. Now, in this particular case, it's obviously Ireland, the female, that's suffering mainly, because that's where Heaney is focused on. And what he's showing is that this process, this wound, will take a long time to fix, a long time to heal. So it's a bleak metaphor, isn't it? Saying that you will not find easy or quick solutions, that it's going to take millennia. And it seems to fit once again into the poem North to me, because in North there doesn't seem to be a solution either, does there? Which is why at the end of North, Heaney has to take his nub treasure, he has to write and be creative, because he sees peace as being a long way off, just like this hideously wounded body, and stretch marked, because what's happened to the landscape of Ireland, it's been stretched and scarred and cut and wounded. The big pain that leaves you raw like open ground. Well, what a fantastic metaphor for a split Ireland, isn't it? As though it's severed like a wound and raw. And you'll notice here the thesaurus that leaves you raw. Lovely pause, like open ground. Pause again. Again. No end stop. Yes, Ruby, no end stop, because, as the again says, there is no end to this violence, just like North, isn't it? So this kind of cycle of violence will continue. There doesn't seem to be any comfort in history. If we're to contrast it with a poem, it would be Bogland, where there's a comfort in history, isn't there? Or Anahorich, where there's comfort in history. Here, there's no comfort in history. We see just a cycle of invasion and rape and violence. Now, what else do I want to compare it to? First of all, I want to compare it to New Song. Okay, in New Song, we have the reclaiming of Irish sexuality and the reclaiming of the Irish body. We have the same orgasmic imagery of the river overflowing, but there it's erotic. So it's about the possibility of reclaiming the land using the same idea of the land as a body, etc., but with a very different thrust, forgive my pun there, in terms of the imagery. Bog Queen seems to me a beautiful link, okay, because in Bog Queen we have all of this kind of sexual violence, etc. It's visited upon the Bog Queen. But what a different ending, don't you think? Where you have the return of the repressed. You have an angry, terrifying female presence that will come back with revenge. You don't have this kind of nasty little fetus that nobody wants. You have instead a woman who's going to rise from the grave, who will be stronger. So it's a much more sort of a poem of sort of resistance and defiance. I think also comparing it to Croppies would be very productive as well. Because in Croppies, we have the violence visited upon the land. We have the hills blushing, beautiful image with all the blood that soaks into them. But rather than it ending with despair, instead, it is about, growth and regeneration and the barley sprouting. So it seems to be much more hopeful. Whereas here we're left with a very bleak view, no end stop, that there is no end in sight for the violence. Over and out.